Please be seated. The sitting is open. The court meets today to hear the first round of oral argument of the Russian Federation. For reasons duly made known to me, Judge Abraham is unable to be present on the bench today. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Alexander V. Shulgin, agent of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it is for me a great honour and a privilege to appear before this Court on behalf of the Russian Federation. Russia has tremendous respect for the International Court of Justice as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and which represents different legal traditions and systems from around the world. Russia counts on the peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with the United Nations Charter, including through a fair and impartial judicial procedure. We are firmly convinced that justice must be rendered openly and independently of political considerations. Indeed, truth must be expressed for justice to be done. It is in this spirit that my country has engaged in good faith in these judicial proceedings concerning two major multilateral conventions: the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, ICSFT, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CERD. Unfortunately, it is not always easy to establish the truth. Today, in the information era, truth sometimes seems to be obvious and easily accessible, whereas in actual fact, it is clouded by a political fog created by information campaigns that are propagated and dominated by the most powerful states and media companies. This makes the judicial task even more difficult than it was before. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, we have heard the applicant during these hearings, and we have no doubts as to its desire to assume the role of accuser while trying to set itself forward as a protector of the peoples of the Crimea against discrimination, while accusing the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics of being a terrorist organization supposedly financed by Russia. Nothing, however, could be further removed from the truth. Kiev has no moral authority allowing it to put forward such accusations. That regime came to power following a violent coup d'etat in 2014. They arrived on the shoulders of nationalists, the direct descendants of Nazi collaborators from the Second World War. The current Ukrainian government openly acclaims and celebrates Nazi war criminals as Ukrainian heroes. The neo-Nazi groups on whose shoulders the current Kiev regime rests began by encouraging the armed revolts in western Ukraine. And this was well before the events that occurred in the East. They continued with the violence at the Maidan in Kiev, the effect of which was to overturn both the president and the legitimate government of Ukraine. As a result, a new government of victors, in inverted commas, including neo-Nazis, leaders of the Maidan, and their collaborators in key positions in charge of the armed forces, the police, and propaganda, came to power. They continued to spread terror throughout the entire country, killing opposition leaders, politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who quite simply dared to express their disagreement. Anyone who opposed, mainly in the eastern regions, in the Donbass, the answer given to these was a massive armed attack by the regime, and at the same time that same regime qualified them as terrorists in order to justify such brutal repression. For a period of 7 years, since the spring of 2014, that regime has decimated Donbass. Shelling, bombing, and daily killings have caused thousands of deaths and thousands of civilians injured, many of whom were children. The soldiers from Kiev and the neo-Nazi battalions have used civilians as human shields in order to protect themselves against the reprisals of the Donbass forces. What Ukraine is now seeking is a decision by your court that would allow it to treat the citizens of Donbass who are fighting for survival as, in inverted commas, equal to terrorists. But it is clear, it is generally acknowledged that the situation in Donbass was a bloody armed conflict between the Kiev regime and the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. A conflict governed by humanitarian law. Aside from Ukraine, nobody has ever considered that these republics were terrorist organizations. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, at the provisional measures stage, the court found that the arguments of Ukraine concerning the financing of terrorism were not plausible, given that Ukraine failed to demonstrate that the acts that it was referring to could even be considered as offences within the meaning of Article 2 of the ICSFT. At the judicial stage and at the stage of admissibility, the court decided to postpone its examination of the main arguments of Russia as to the merits, in particular those concerning intention and knowledge. Today, we are going to show you how Ukraine's claims are not just implausible. What is more, they are based on flawed interpretations of law and contradict even elementary common sense, and they are based either on fake factual evidence or contradict Ukraine's own position. The same can be said of Ukraine's allegations concerning a so-called systemic campaign of racial discrimination, I quote, against the Ukrainians and Tatars of Crimea. Ukraine has committed violations of Crimeans' rights, and this has been recorded over a period of years, nonetheless sets itself up as their protector today. It is all the more hypocritical because Kiev, together with the Mejlis, has established a blockade of Crimea, cutting off the peninsula from access to water, food, electricity, medication and other essentials to the detriment of the population. What is more, the members of the Mejlis set off bombs in order to destroy the energy lines leading to Crimea, thus depriving the entire population of Crimea of electricity. Ukraine is now looking for flaws in the educational system of Crimea, while approving the ban not only on education in the Russian language beyond elementary school, but also use of the Russian language in the media and in public life, notwithstanding the fact that the Russian language in Ukraine, contrary to the Ukrainian language in Crimea, is a language in daily use for the majority of the population. The actions taken by the regime in Kiev, contrary to the legal effervescence of its council, show that our opponents have no real interest in the well-being of Crimeans, nor for the struggle against their so-called, and I quote, discrimination. Kiev's real objective is not to fight against discrimination, but to challenge the status of Crimea, which is not at issue in this case, as the court itself affirmed in its judgment of 2019. Ukraine shows similar bad faith in the case of Donbass. There, too, it was not interested in a peaceful solution. The Minsk agreements were based on the idea of a return of Donbass under the control of Ukraine, while respecting the desire of the Donbass population to enjoy broader autonomy. It transpires today, according to the former Ukrainian, French and German leaders who signed or guaranteed these Minsk agreements, that their only real purpose was to give Ukraine time to arm itself for a military solution to the Donbass question. Unfortunately, Kiev never intended to respect these agreements. Its only objective was to conquer Donbass by force. Kiev's actions ultimately pushed the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics into invoking their right to self-determination and legitimate defense, including collective legitimate defense, in accordance with the provisions of the United Nations Charter and international customary law. Of course, this case does not concern the most recent events. In fact, it only concerns the events that occurred between 2014 and 2017. Nonetheless, as Ukraine's agent has focused so much on this aspect, I will say that it is Ukraine which rejected the Minsk agreement